Hello and welcome to the 74th Bi-Monthly Breastfeeding Coalition's webinar. I am Cheryl Lebedevich, Senior Workplace Program Manager and Policy Analyst at USBC, and I am so glad to welcome you to this session. This webinar series is jointly hosted by CDC's Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity, and by the USBC. This series, called the 222, are held on the second Tuesdays of even-numbered months from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And the purpose of this series is to bring together practitioners and advocates from the field of maternal and child health to share best practices and resources and to network and collaborate on issues of national significance. We alternate the sessions, highlighting the work of breastfeeding coalitions one month and a national or regional organization the next. Anyone interested in transforming the landscape of breastfeeding support can join us for these free webinars. To get all our announcements, you can join the Coalition's Learning Connection at the link that you see here. A user account is required, but it only takes a few seconds to set up. Alternatively, if you go to usbreastfeeding.org/coalitions-webinars, you'll be able to see topic and speaker details from past and future webinars. To streamline access, the webinars have been set up as a series. Once you register for a session, you are set. You will receive reminders before each webinar with the topic and speaker details. And while we understand that it's not possible to attend every session live in the midst of your busy workday, so there's easy access to all archived recordings. The webinar presentation, handouts, and video recordings of this and past sessions can all be found on the Coalition's webinar page at the link you see here. And you can see the link in the chat box to where you can find this webinar page, and you'll also see it in your webinar confirmation email. You can get to the 222 series on the USBC website through the drop-down menu under the Webinars tab, as you can see here. For today's sessions, all participants are in listen-only mode. We're going to have about 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. However, we hope this is going to be as interactive as possible despite the virtual format. So please feel free to share your insights and questions as they come up during the session. And here's how you're going to do that. You're going to simply go to that control panel on the right side of your screen. If you don't see it, it may be minimized. So just click on that little orange tab and it'll pop back out. If you scroll down below the audio section, you'll see a tab for questions. And when you click on it, it'll open up a box for you to type in. If you have any webinar-related tech problems, please send an email to coalitions@usbreastfeeding.org and our staff will do their very best to help you. And with that, I am so very delighted to introduce today's presenters. Liz Morris is the Deputy Director of the Center for Work-Life Law and an adjunct law professor at the University of California, Hastings. Liz works to advance gender equity and workers' rights nationwide. Her advocacy focuses on expanding legal protections for pregnant, parenting, and breastfeeding employees and students, improving employer practices to promote stability and economic security for low-wage workers, and addressing employment discrimination against women and family caregivers of all genders. Jessica Lee is a staff attorney at the Center for Work-Life Law. She works to advance gender equality in educational opportunities and in the workplace, with a particular focus on discrimination faced by pregnant women. Jessica leads the center's work on developing and implementing best practices to ensure Title IX's mandate prohibiting pregnancy discrimination in higher education. And that brings me to today's topic, exposed discrimination against breastfeeding workers. Discrimination against breastfeeding workers has devastating health and economic consequences and represents a major barrier to breastfeeding in the U.S. Based on new findings from this groundbreaking study from the amazing ladies you'll hear from today at the Center for Work-Life Law, this webinar is going to explore the challenges that breastfeeding workers face, including lack of accommodations, sexual harassment, job loss, and early weaning. Expert panelists will present the current state of workplace breastfeeding laws and highlight where legal protections fall short. They will share public policy solutions that can be implemented not only at the federal level, but also by states and local governments to ensure breastfeeding workers have the basic protections they need to continue breastfeeding after returning to work. Webinar participants will also learn about existing resources to help breastfeeding workers who need workplace accommodations today. So thank you. I will pass it your way.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, and thanks very much to USBC and the CDC for inviting us today to share our findings. When we launched this project, Jessica and I set out to study the nature and the extent of discrimination faced by breastfeeding workers. We looked at the breastfeeding discrimination legal cases from the last decade. We worked with Heidi Shearholtz at the Economic Policy Institute to crunch data on legal protections, and we conducted interviews with breastfeeding workers. And I can tell you that even as experts on this topic, what we found truly shocked us. We came across many workers who were denied simple pumping breaks, even though they were in pain and leaking milk through their blouses. We talked to people who developed mastitis, fevers, and diminished milk supply. A 911 dispatcher named Katie said she often had to work in a soiled bra and suffered 3 separate breast infections because her supervisors refused to give her pumping accommodation. We came across women who weren't provided private, clean spaces, so were forced to pump milk for their children in filthy, moldy ones, on toilet stalls, directly in front of their coworkers, and in physically unsafe conditions in some cases. One construction worker resorted to pumping inside an air conditioning unit. A prison nurse we spoke with, Susan, couldn't get permission to bring her pump into the prison where she worked, so she had to smuggle it in piece by piece and then covertly hide it away from her coworkers. Another woman at the Department of Health, Kate, was told she couldn't go across the street to nurse her son at his daycare, even though she and her coworkers had always previously been allowed to leave the building for all sorts of personal reasons, like, for example, going to get donuts. Perhaps the thing that shocked us the most was the significant economic consequences that flow from breastfeeding discrimination. We were surprised to learn how many of these women lost their jobs just for feeding their babies, either because they quit when they were forced to choose between breastfeeding and working, or because they were just fired outright, even for just asking for pumping accommodation. Perhaps less surprising, but of course equally problematic, is that women are facing health consequences as a result of breastfeeding discrimination, and they're being forced to wean their babies earlier than their doctors recommend. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague and report co-author Jessica Lee to tell us a little bit about what breastfeeding workers need at work. We're going to talk more after that about what happens when these needs aren't met, as well as some of the forms of breastfeeding discrimination we encountered in our study. And then we're going to wrap up by looking at the current legal rights breastfeeding workers have, how the laws are still failing us, and what simple policy solutions exist that would make this a whole lot easier for millions of breastfeeding parents.
Thanks, Liz. So let's talk about what breastfeeding workers need. Lactating parents are constantly producing milk. This doesn't stop for the workday, and the milk needs to be expressed about as frequently as their baby would feed in order for the parent to keep producing as much milk as the baby needs. As the saying goes, you have to move milk to make milk. And to that end, breastfeeding workers need, first of all, time for expressing milk. This is usually every 2 to 3 hours, depending on how old the baby is and their needs. So I'm frequently asked how much time is reasonable. And we commonly consider 15 to 20 minutes to be average, but I should be very clear here that it can vary significantly from person to person. It can even vary by time of day. Also, that 15 to 20 minutes is just the pumping. It does not include the time it takes to travel to the lactation location, set up the pump, break down and wash the pump parts, store the milk, and then walk back to the employee's work area. Because setup and travel can waste a lot of time, and because moms who are comfortable release their milk more readily, the quality of the lactation space impacts the amount of time needed. So let's talk about that space. The baseline essential is to have space that is private. This means free from intrusion and also the sight and sound of others. I should note a number of the mothers I spoke with needed to have space that was also free from interruption because that interruption and fear of being intruded on actually make their pumping take longer. The space also needs to be clean because this is little food for little tummies and little immune systems. Because the most efficient pumps are electric, it is also important to have access to electricity. But that's just the baseline. The best lactation spaces, as many of you know, are near the employee's work site, have a sink and maybe even a fridge in or near the space, and are equipped with a comfortable chair and a flat surface for the employee's pump. Finally, and this is often overlooked, breastfeeding workers may need other reasonable accommodations so that they can continue to work and protect their milk supply. An example would be a uniform modification for a mom who can't fit her old one without compressing her breasts and risking health consequences as a result. Another example would be moms who need time off of work to attend to a breast infection. Breastfeeding workers who had access to both time and space were 2.3 times as likely to be breastfeeding exclusively at 6 months. Unfortunately, only about 1 in 3 workers nationwide actually has that time and space that makes such a critical difference for breastfeeding parents. Here's one of them. I had blood in my milk from waiting so long, but I had to keep working. This is Simone Teagle, an NYPD police officer. This is an unsettling example of what can happen when a breastfeeding worker doesn't get the accommodation she needs. Simone was harassed for breastfeeding and denied even basic time and space for pumping. She was forced to wait so long that she got a very severe and excruciating breast infection. And that is one of the short-term consequences of breastfeeding discrimination, following a fairly common trend. First, a mother may experience pain from her breasts being too full, and this can be incredibly challenging to focus on anything else when you're in this pain. Delaying breast milk can also result in embarrassing leaking on the job and can progress to clogged ducts or a breast infection called mastitis. Missing pump or feeding sessions also means that moms aren't moving that milk, sending the message to their body that their baby doesn't need more milk and that their breasts don't need to make more. So parents often aren't able to make enough milk to keep up with their child's needs. This means supplementation with formula at an earlier than desired time, and very often full weaning earlier than recommended or desired. Several of the women we spoke with for the report told us that their babies initially had negative reactions to the formula or challenges taking a bottle, so that can be a short-term consequence as well. In terms of long-term consequences, employer discrimination can and does result in very serious long-term health consequences. And I don't think that most employers or even the public really talk about this often. Babies who are not breastfed for the recommended term face higher rates of illness and disease like SIDS, diabetes, leukemia, and lymphoma. And their mothers face higher rates of breast and ovarian cancers, diabetes, heart disease, and other illnesses. Not only is this an unfair health decision for employers to be making on behalf of their employees, but this also is hurting the employer in terms of more missed sick days, more turnover, and increased health insurance costs. Having to choose to leave a career I love was one of the most difficult decisions of my life, but I had to do what I thought was best for my family. Let's talk a bit about the financial consequences of breastfeeding discrimination. Of course, the entire reason an employer has the power to push their worker into early weaning is the financial consequences. They control the worker's paycheck and livelihood. Workers can and do lose their jobs because they are breastfeeding. In fact, we looked at all of the breastfeeding discrimination cases from the last 10 years. And here's what we found. We found that in nearly 2/3 of the cases, the mom lost her job. Sometimes this was the result of the boss making the work environment so bad that the mom felt she had no choice. So forced resignation, 20% of cases. Other times it was direct firing because of breastfeeding. So again, in 2/3 of the cases, the mom lost her job. In about 1 in 10 of those cases, there was some other form of economic harm. Now, a direct firing because of breastfeeding is exactly what happened to a woman called Marina, who is a worker at a taqueria. Her boss found out that she had breastfed her baby in her car during a break. He told her not to come back to work until she had weaned her baby. And when Marina told him she really needed the job, he then fired her. This is a really shocking example of what can happen, and also the unique impact that it has on low-wage workers. Marina and her partner had to take out loans and rely on donations just to afford rent and food for their other children. And now we know about Marina's story because she chose to fight back and filed a discrimination charge. By the way, she won. But most moms don't do that, particularly lower income mothers. They're often in crisis and more worried about making ends meet than going through this long process to get justice. And unlike Marina, many moms aren't in locations with strong laws or a strong community of support to assist in filing the charge. Finally, for many low-income workers, just this horrendous threat of being without a paycheck and therefore being unable to pay rent, pay bills, or buy food is enough for them to go ahead and wean or supplement in order to not rock the boat at work and be sure to keep their job. Sadly, we don't know just how many families this has happened to already.
There were days I was afraid I'd get fired or get messed with on the job. Some days I felt super strong, thinking, I can do this and they shouldn't be treating women like this. This is the voice of Sarah Spreich, a paramedic that worked for the Chicago Fire Department, who faced retaliation after asserting her need to pump breast milk at work. And Sarah's story fits into one of the most pronounced patterns we identified in studying the breastfeeding discrimination legal cases, which is that women in male-dominated industries are significantly more likely to face hostility and retaliation for breastfeeding. And that particularly includes first responders like police and paramedics. We found that although only a very small percentage, no more than 16% of women work in predominantly male industries, almost half of all breastfeeding discrimination cases were brought by women working in those industries. It's long been documented that women in male-dominated industries are more likely to face discrimination, like sexual harassment. So unfortunately, for many of these women, the need to pump milk only reinforces the pre-existing belief that some of their coworkers may have that they don't belong in what may be considered to be a man's job. And here's the next pattern: biased against mothers. This is another pattern we identified, which is that discrimination against breastfeeding women is often part of a larger pattern of discrimination against mothers. It's well documented that one of the strongest forms of bias against women, and this is bias that's largely responsible for the gender wage gap and other forms of sex discrimination, it stems from bias against mothers. After having children, women may find they've been devalued by their colleagues and their managers. We know they're less likely to be hired. Mothers are less likely to be hired. They're less likely to be promoted, and they're paid less. Social science tells us that this is because mothers are assumed to be less committed to their jobs and are assumed to be less committed to perform them. So a request for breastfeeding accommodation can be a lightning rod in the hand of an employee who has already been portrayed as a company burden or written off. And this was true of one insurance company employee, Angela. When she returned from maternity leave, her supervisor told her on her first day back in the office that none of her work had been done while she was away. She had 2 weeks to complete it or she would face discipline. Meanwhile, while this was going on, Angela was struggling throughout the morning to find any private space to pump. Finally, she went to her supervisor in tears, asking if she could help her, the supervisor could help her to secure a private pumping location. It had been 5 hours since she'd last expressed milk, and so she was in considerable physical pain at that point. Instead of helping Angela, her supervisor said, quote, "You know, I think it's best that you go home to be with your babies." Her supervisor handed Angela a piece of paper and dictated a resignation letter. So in this situation, Angela's pumping needs were actually used against her to push her out of the job. Finally, we found that some workers are facing sexual harassment, where coworkers made crude remarks about breastfeeding mothers' breasts, compared them to animals, or mooed at them. One worker, an assistant in the television industry, her supervisor pretended to grab and squeeze her breasts during a company meeting. A U.S. Air Force airman who needed pumping breaks told us that her male supervisor said she should not, quote, "get time to go play with herself." So now that we've sort of documented this widespread problem and its truly devastating consequences, let's shift gears and talk about how we can address this issue. First, we're going to take a look at the current legal protections for breastfeeding workers, the existing legal protections. And the good news is that the rights of breastfeeding workers have exploded over the last decade. Where breastfeeding employees had almost no rights 10 years ago, they now have many. The most well-known protection was signed into law by President Obama in 2010 as part of the Affordable Care Act. The Break Time for Nursing Mothers Law requires employers nationwide to provide eligible employees with two things. First, reasonable break time to express breast milk as needed during the workday for the baby's first year. And second, a place that is shielded from view and free from intrusion, meaning a private space that is not a bathroom to pump milk. Note, this is important, despite what you may have heard or read, this law applies to employers of all sizes. Employers that have fewer than 50 employees may be excused from complying with the law in a particular case if providing break time or space would impose an undue hardship, which is basically a significant difficulty or expense. But all employer sizes are covered by this law, and large employers don't have any legal excuse not to comply with it. Now, at the time it was passed, the Nursing Mothers Law was critical landmark legislation, and it has done so much good for so many people. Over the years, however, some significant shortcomings with this law have emerged. First, due to an unintentional legal technicality, the law leaves out 9 million women of childbearing age, meaning they're not covered by the law. The legal standard for determining whether somebody is covered by the law or left out is extremely complicated and fact-specific. Now, although most hourly workers are covered by the law, whether somebody's covered depends on their job duties, their education, as well as whether they're paid on a salary basis, a fee basis, by the hour, how much they earn. So all this is to say it's very complicated. But with that caveat, I do want to provide you with a list of categories of workers that are often, but please know, not always, left out of this law. Teachers, registered nurses, and note nursing and teachers are two of the top pink-collar jobs. Many, but not all, transportation workers, many agricultural workers, retail workers who work on commission, many managers and professionals, and other categories of workers not listed here. In many of these cases, the employee has to earn a certain amount of money, which is typically $455 per week, and they have to be paid on a salary or fee basis in order to actually be excluded from the law's protections. But exactly what level and type of compensation is required varies depending on the job. So to find out if a particular employee's duties and salary level exclude her from the protections, you can call the number that you see here to talk to a representative from the Department of Labor. That's 1-800-USA-WAGE. You can also call the Center for Work-Life Law. We operate a free legal hotline, and we're going to give you information on how to contact us on that hotline here at the end of the webinar. Okay, the second shortcoming of the Nursing Mothers Law is that its protections are of a limited nature. So it is limited to only break time and space, first of all. So employers who need other accommodations beyond break time and space, like, for example, a modified uniform that's less restrictive across the chest, or perhaps to avoid exposure to toxic chemicals that are dangerous while breastfeeding, people who need other accommodations are out of luck. Second, it is limited to only for milk expression. This means that direct breastfeeding is not protected, even in cases where it'd be totally feasible to allow someone to directly breastfeed. And we saw this come up with one government employee, Kate Frederick, whose doctor sent a note to Kate's employer asking that she be allowed to directly breastfeed, both because her son was absolutely refusing a bottle, and also because Kate had a health condition that could be improved by direct breastfeeding. Even though Kate had someone who was willing to bring her baby to her during the workday at her office, and her coworkers' children visited the office regularly, and her baby was only 2 months old, her employer said she was forbidden from using the on-site lactation room to nurse her baby, because according to the employer, that room was for pumping only. They told Kate that if she wanted to breastfeed her son, she could use the public lobby in the government building where she worked. The judge who reviewed all of the evidence in Kate's case called the employer's refusal to allow Kate to breastfeed her son a, quote, unfortunate, even deplorable insensitivity and intransigence, but still threw out Kate's claim under the Nursing Mothers Law because direct breastfeeding simply is not covered by that law. Third, the break time law is limited only for the employee's nursing child. So situations of surrogacy or a loss of a child would not be covered, even though pumping may be important to a woman's own health. And finally, it's limited to only 1 year, even though 1 in 3 babies is still nursing at that cutoff point. And then the final shortcoming with the Nursing Mothers Law is that there are major enforcement challenges with this law. This means that even in cases where clear violations occur, employees cannot effectively seek justice in court. Employees who have suffered health and economic consequences cannot sue their employer for monetary damages for a direct violation of this law. Now, there are other laws that may help, and we're going to talk about those. And employees can file claims with the Department of Labor, which has the authority to sort of intervene and attempt to help a worker get what they need if it isn't too late. Without a financial penalty, though, for violations, employers are less likely to comply with the law. And indeed, we've seen that there's been widespread noncompliance with this law. So the lack of an effective way to enforce the law is arguably its most significant shortcoming. So we're going to talk a little bit later about how that can be remedied. Okay, as I noted, there are other laws that are enforceable in court and that provide, sort of fill in some of these gaps. So one of those is the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which is part of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, Employment Anti-Discrimination Law. In recent years, this law has been interpreted to protect breastfeeding workers. So it does a few things. First, it prohibits discrimination. So that means someone can't be fired, penalized, or not hired because they're breastfeeding or because they asked to pump or because they're pumping. So this would include people like the taqueria worker, Marina, that Jessica spoke about, who was fired for breastfeeding her baby in the parking lot. It would include Allison, an EMT who interviewed for a job at an ambulance company. Allison was offered and accepted a position before she told the manager of the company that she needed a space to pump milk during her breaks. Allison said that the manager immediately became cold and said she should just pump in the bathroom. After that, Allison was never even put on the schedule and then fired a few days later. This type of thing is illegal discrimination under Title VII. Title VII also prohibits sexual harassment. So derogatory comments based on breastfeeding or pumping, threats, or other behavior that's so bad that it creates a hostile work environment constitutes sexual harassment. Finally, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act requires employers to give breastfeeding employees the same freedoms to address lactation-related needs as other employees are given for their needs. So if other employees get schedule changes, job transfers, or modified work duties for reasons other than breastfeeding, then breastfeeding workers often have a right to receive those same freedoms or accommodations. So for example, one nurse we spoke with said that her coworkers were allowed to take smoke breaks, but she wasn't allowed to take breaks to pump. In other words, she was being treated worse than other employees who needed breaks. Even though this law gives breastfeeding workers a right to receive, and so she wasn't being treated as well as them, so that would constitute discrimination under this law. So even though this law gives breastfeeding workers a right to receive accommodations that are given to their coworkers in certain cases, in reality, in the real world, Title VII can't be reliably counted on to secure breastfeeding accommodations. Especially if the employer doesn't accommodate other people, because then there's nobody who gets accommodations, or if the breastfeeding employee doesn't have legal assistance, because as you can tell, this is sort of a complicated law. So those are the federal legal rights that I just shared with you, and I'm going to turn it back over now to Jessica to talk about rights that many states give breastfeeding workers.
Thanks, Liz. Thankfully, there are another set of laws to turn to support breastfeeding workers, and I'm talking about these state laws. So for our report, we conducted an analysis of the laws of all 50 states, as well as DC and Puerto Rico. And something unique about this analysis is that we looked not only at the time and space laws, but also anti-discrimination laws and reasonable accommodation laws to get a picture of workers' rights that is complete. And so we have here a little snapshot of this map, and here's a little bit about what we found. So there were 21 states and DC which have laws that clearly provide break time and space for nursing mothers. Now, the laws often look different from state to state, but they provide a clear right, and most of the laws cover all sizes of employers and include employees in every sort of industry. Next, there are 8 states that have other kinds of laws. For example, Virginia and Louisiana cover teachers, just teachers. Texas and Montana cover public employees. And Georgia has a law that says employers may, but not must, provide certain accommodations. These are just examples of some of the laws which aren't comprehensive. And then in some of the states on this map that are a lighter color, they offer protection by explicitly prohibiting discrimination because of lactation in their state law. So this is similar to Title VII, but at the state level, and it explicitly includes lactation. For more information, excuse me, for more information on the laws in your state and links to USBC state-specific resources, you can see this map at the link at the bottom of the screen here. So while all of this is promising and there is a very clear trend towards protecting breastfeeding moms at work, this patchwork that you see here, these states that are blank, it's just not enough. And here's why. Here's what this looks like. 27.6 million women of childbearing age don't have the basic legal protections needed by all breastfeeding workers. So in other words, 3 out of every 4 women workers of childbearing age are without the break time, the space, and the accommodation protections that they need. So when you add up all of these folks left out by the federal law, the state laws just aren't protecting enough workers. The patchwork has too many holes in it, and breastfeeding moms are falling through the cracks. And this is one of those workers who was left out, Catherine, who is an elementary school teacher. She said to me, "By midday, my boobs were so full that I just began leaking everywhere. soaked through my shirt and sweater. I started thinking, I'm here teaching these babies basic life skills, and I don't even have the time to provide my own baby with food for survival. Catherine went home that very night and told her husband that she just couldn't do it anymore, and they would need to figure out how to make their ends meet when she quit her job. Catherine left, but we need to do better for workers like Catherine and all of the teachers, nurses, and other workers out there who don't even have the most basic accommodations they need to keep breastfeeding and earning a paycheck. But as we work towards policies to stop this from happening to other workers, there is still a lot we can do to protect these workers. So I'm just share a couple resources here. First of all, the USBC Workplace Constellation. This is a home for advocates on this issue and a really incredible resource for folks who want to learn more about how to provide workplace support. One of the efforts of the Workplace Coalition is the Breastfeeding Works webinar series, which is a project of the Constellation designed to provide more in-depth conversation about these laws and advocacy strategies for supporting breastfeeding workers in particular industries. Some of you might have joined us for our webinar yesterday for healthcare workers. That will be posted at this link and on the Workplace Constellation website very soon. And we'll keep posting them on there for those of you who aren't members or who don't see those announcements. But I really encourage you to sign up to get this training. Finally, we have the Work-Life Law free legal hotline at this number or on our website, pregnantatwork.org. Any parent who thinks that they are dealing with breastfeeding discrimination, pregnancy discrimination, or other forms of caregiving discrimination can contact our hotline by phone or through our website to learn more. And now to talk a bit more about the policy solutions, back to Liz.
Thanks, Jess. And also just to add, our free legal hotline provides information not only to workers facing discrimination, but also to students. Jessica heads up that work. So that's another resource available. Okay, so shifting gears to policy solutions now. Our report outlines policies that can be enacted not only by the federal government, but also and perhaps more promisingly by states to address the problems that we've documented in the report. We're going to mention just a few of the highlights from what we found in terms of policy solutions in our report. So first, I noted earlier that one of the biggest challenges with the federal nursing mothers law is that it can't be effectively enforced in court, meaning that if a violation occurs, if someone's denied break time and space, they can't sue their employer for monetary damages to compensate them for the harm they suffered. Now, that's unfair to the individual worker who may have lost her job or been forced to stop breastfeeding because of her employer's failure to follow the law, but also on a larger scale, laws that can't be effectively enforced are simply less effective, and employers are more likely to just ignore them, as we've seen happen in many cases with the nursing mothers law. In reality, low-wage workers are the least likely to know about their rights and to be able to seek legal assistance to enforce them. So from an equity perspective, we want a law that is strong enough to act as a motivator for employers and a deterrent to unlawful behavior, so the most vulnerable workers will be more likely to get what they need. Now, before we move on, I just want to be clear. If you know a breastfeeding worker who's been treated unfairly, she should still talk to a lawyer or call our free legal hotline. I am not saying there's never any legal recourse. There is in many cases, but the enforcement mechanism for the nursing mothers law is weak and must be strengthened. Next, we want to make sure that, make sure my slide's advancing. Okay. Next, we want to make sure that the law requires pumping spaces that actually work for pumping. So spaces for pumping and breastfeeding should be nearby the employee's workstation. They should be private. They should be sanitary enough to prepare food. And they should be equipped, always with a chair and flat surface to place the pump. And to the extent reasonably possible, they should have an electrical outlet or an extension cord for the pump. Jessica, do you want to wrap up with the policy solutions?
Sorry, challenge with mute button. Next, we need to have laws that cover all breastfeeding workers. Now, this sounds like a solution that is pretty simple, but it's very necessary to spell this out. So we need to cover all workers. That's all employer sizes and all industries. These accommodations are so easy to provide that size and industry shouldn't matter for the vast majority of cases. Next, we need to cover all infant ages because how many babies or their moms wake up on the day of the baby's first birthday and say, "Great, I'm weaned." Breastfeeding beyond 1 year is common and important and should also be protected. We need laws that cover all genders because not everyone who provides milk for their baby presents or identifies as a woman. And we need laws that cover all types of parents, including surrogate parents and adoptive parents. And then finally, we need to cover all sorts of health needs. Laws should have enough flexibility to make them usable by real people and the many variations that occur for these people. Finally, our policy solutions need to be economically realistic for low-wage workers. Here's why. Picture a worker who is going through an 8-hour shift, 5 days a week. She might need to pump 3 times a day at 30 minutes each. That's $54 lost per week out of a total paycheck pre-tax of $290. That's 19% of her salary, nearly the equivalent of 1 day per week salary lost. So if we're serious about breastfeeding equity, health equity, and economic stability for all families, we need to keep the conversation going on paid break time for milk expression. This could look different depending on what's feasible in different states. It may be as simple as being clear that employees can use their sick time or vacation time to cover hours missed, or a requirement like Illinois has to just compensate for pumping time. But this has to be a part of the conversation. So we spoke today about a lot of challenging situations and stories of discrimination. And I got to tell you, as someone who hears these stories day in and day out, I know it can be overwhelming, but I do have hope. And the good news is that there are hundreds of you on the line. While so many moms are left out, and only roughly half of the states currently have breastfeeding laws to protect breastfeeding mothers in the workplace, there has been a huge wave of legislation for breastfeeding mothers at work, starting in 1998 with Minnesota, all the way up to South Carolina, passed just last year. Breastfeeding advocates are a force to be reckoned with, and I'm sure that while so many breastfeeding moms are currently left out, it won't stay that way for long. We can and will make laws that will protect breastfeeding parents at work and ensure they can provide this critical first food for their babies while still earning a paycheck. So for today, please know whether you're a working parent or an advocate for them, we are here to support you, and we have tons of resources available to assist you if you're interested in supporting better policies or just strategizing about how to support workers. Please get in touch with us for additional resources and check out these links on your screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz and Jess, for sharing highlights about this study and just making it such an amazing, humanizing experience to learn about legislation in a way that really encompasses what it means to be a breastfeeding employee. We're going to take questions. We have had lots and lots coming in, so we're going to try to do as many of these as we can. So please bear with us if you don't hear your question answered right away. Our first one is asking about, are there any laws in place for breastfeeding mothers who choose or need for time's sake to pump in a public setting, such as a break room or at her desk?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of the question. Are there laws that protect breastfeeding workers who choose to pump in a public place?
Yes.
Such as what?
Such as a break room or at her desk.
Oh, or at her desk. Well, the laws, is it all 50 states now protect a person's right to breastfeed in public? I'm not sure if those extend to pumping, but I think the fact that Title VII prohibits discrimination against breastfeeding. If a woman were to say, you know what, I want to keep getting my work done, I don't want to extend my workday, I'm going to pump here at my desk, I think that she would have a strong legal argument that that activity would be protected under Title VII, and her employer couldn't tell her, no, you can't do that. Does that address the question that's being asked?
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Liz, I think a lot of the laws, the way they're written now, it's designed for mothers who don't want to do that, to have an option to go into that room and have a private location. But I would say, absolutely, moms should feel comfortable pushing for whatever sort of accommodation actually helps them get the job done as economically as possible. I personally, when I was pumping at work, I pumped at my desk under a cover because that's just the best way that I could get my work done. But it needs to be very clear that that's the mother's choice, and that's not something that she is pressured into doing by her employer. That I think I definitely have concerns that someone will just say, oh, well, why can't you just pump while you're going about your business here, making the mother uncomfortable or exposing her to harassment, or even just working through breaks without being properly compensated for those breaks. So we just want to be clear that that would be the mother's choice and not something she's pushed into doing, is the first red flag that sort of was raised for me. But for moms out there doing that, more power to you.
Amen.
Thank you so much. We have a question here asking how large the group studied. So they're asking about, where all of these the claims that you talk about in your report came from.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Center for Work-Life Law maintains a database of all of the family responsibilities discrimination legal cases that we are able to identify, and it goes back past 10 years, but what we looked at for this study was the last 10 years. And we find those legal cases through a variety of means. Most primarily, we rely on legal search databases like Westlaw and Lexis, and we have terms set up to capture cases that concern family responsibilities discrimination. And family responsibilities discrimination includes breastfeeding discrimination. So we cannot guarantee that we have looked at every single case, because there may be some that slip through the cracks, but we have captured many of them and gone to great lengths to do so. Now, it is important to note, though, that the cases that we're analyzing, when we say 2/3 of the cases ended in job loss, those are cases, when we say cases, we mean cases where people actually filed some sort of claim against their employer of discrimination or failure to accommodate. So that wouldn't include somebody who did not stand up and pursue some kind of legal action against their employer. We did also interview people, but who didn't stand up and file claims against their employer, but that obviously we didn't interview everybody who's faced discrimination. The workplace data that we studied in terms of coming up with the number of people who are covered and not covered by the laws, that is data that is provided by the federal government that looks at people nationwide, and it's obviously based on economic models, not a survey or something like that, but it's meant to capture everybody nationwide.
Thanks. And yeah, we also have a question related to that, asking about how the information around coverage is disaggregated in your report, really specifically looking at, does it have breakdowns by race and by state?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we do have everything that we provide broken down by state. With regard to the non-coverage under the Fair Labor Standards Act, we also have that broken down by industry, geography, and race. So I can just tell you for race, for example, Black and Hispanic women are actually more likely than white and Asian women to be protected by the Nursing Mothers Law because they're more likely to work in the hourly jobs that are covered by the requirements. In other words, they're less likely to fall into those categories of exempt workers. But still, over 1 million Black women and nearly 1 million Hispanic women are uncovered. And if you want to sort of dig into all the information with the industries, for example, most uncovered women are in education and health services, or the geography where these women who are uncovered are living, then we have lengthy appendices at the end of the report where you can find all of that information.
Thank you. We have a few questions and expressions of surprise to learn that teachers and nurses are not protected by the Break Time for Nursing Mothers Law, and looking for a little bit of information about why that is.
Sure. So the basic reason why we have these shortcomings with the law, why people aren't covered, why it's unenforceable, is that when the law was passed, it was passed as an amendment to a pre-existing law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA. The FLSA is a law that dates back to post-Depression era that was put in place to regulate the hours and wages of workers. So it provides overtime compensation and minimum wage compensation, and prohibits child labor, for example. So that law was amended so that the Break Time for Nursing Mothers provision was placed within that law in the overtime section, it turns out. And there's a number of categories of workers who are exempt from federal overtime, and teachers and registered nurses who earn a particular salary, and some of those other categories of workers we discussed are exempt from receiving overtime, meaning they're not entitled to receive overtime. And that's for a variety of reasons, mostly political. But when the Break Time for Nursing Mothers Law was passed in 2010, having these same exclusions apply to the nursing mothers provision was actually unintentional. So there's no reason why those people would be excluded. Same thing with the enforcement piece. The only remedy that's available under the Fair Labor Standards Act for a violation is unpaid minimum wages and overtime, which makes sense if we're talking about minimum wage and overtime violations, but it makes no sense when we're talking about breast infection or job loss or early weaning because of a violation of the break time law. And so that's why we need to find solutions that are tailored toward tailored toward coverage and enforcement with nursing parents, nursing workers in mind.
And I will just urge folks listening whose reaction is like mine when I first learned of this, who are really dismayed about the lack of rights there for teachers or for nurses. Just don't forget there's that other anti-discrimination law, Title VII. For teachers, there's also Title IX. And then there are a lot of state laws that would apply to cover these workers. So don't assume that it is without hope, and I hope you'll check out the laws in your state or contact us for more information.
Great point.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll take one final question. We have a couple of folks asking whether there are particular laws with components that are especially powerful or particular recommendations that you have.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we think the most important components are that should be contained in the law are outlined in the report in a section about policy solutions. And I think, what you should sort of advocate for in your own state depends on where you're starting in your state. So if you already have a strong breastfeeding law like we do in California, maybe the next thing you want to push for is the provisions that Jessica talked about to make it sort of economically realistic so that people aren't losing pay in order to take breaks to pump. If you're in a state where you don't even have a sex discrimination or pregnancy breastfeeding discrimination statute, perhaps you might want to start smaller because that's probably more politically feasible. We at the Center for Work-Life Law would be happy to talk through with anybody what sort of makes sense to pursue in the state where they live, but somebody who's sort of looking for what are all of the various protections that breastfeeding workers need should definitely check out the report available at pregnantatwork.org.
Yes, and I wonder, Jess, can we flip back to your contact information on this previous page just one more time? We have several questions coming in with really particular cases, so I would just really urge you to don't hesitate to reach out. Jess and Liz are incredible resources, and they are so inspired and always going out of their way to provide the support that people need. So don't hesitate to reach out or look at any of these resources.
Absolutely. And if you're talking about particular cases, as Jess noted, we have a free legal hotline where we provide information to people about their legal rights and talk through sort of practical steps that people can take to get what they need in their workplace. And so we are funded to provide that support and hope you'll take advantage of it if it's needed.
Thank you so very much. This was so informative and inspiring, and recognizing all the gaps we face and also the hope for a better tomorrow. With that, we're going to transition to do a few quick updates from USBC. So I'm going to pass over to Sarah Walls. She is the Senior Communications and Program Coordinator here at USBC.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you again, ladies. That was such an incredible webinar to listen to, and I am so in awe of the work that you both do, and it is so exciting to be able to build on this incredible report. So as I hope that you all know, USBC is hosting a virtual advocacy event next week. So if you're feeling really fired up to advocate for breastfeeding workers, next week might be a great time for it. What we are hoping to do is every day we'll have a new action, whether it is sending a direct message to your congressperson or tweeting to them or sharing some graphics with your friends and family, just to drum up support for breastfeeding policies in the coming session based on a survey that we sent out at the end of last year, and supporting working parents is part of our agenda for this week. Just to acknowledge that there is the possibility of a shutdown at the end of this week, and if that does happen, we will continue to find a different time to advocate when attention can be more focused on breastfeeding. But we hope that that doesn't happen, and we hope that you'll join us either on our Facebook event page, or you can find more information on our website, and I'll pop the link in the chat as well. So we hope to see you all virtually advocating for breastfeeding.
Thank you very much. And we will be talking about how to support working parents through stronger laws and policies. Next, we're going to turn to Camille Abbey. She's our Events and Public Relations Manager, to share some exciting updates about the NBCC.
Thanks, Cheryl. Hi, everyone. Just a couple of quick notes about our annual conference. Firstly, I think everyone knows it's in June this year, so it's not in August with National Breastfeeding Month. It is in June, mid-June, in Bethesda, Maryland. So you can fly into any of those DC area airports and conveniently get to our hotel. We are on the Metro line, so if you fly into Reagan, that works really easily. A couple things I wanted to share that are brand new. and or deadlines. So the first is a deadline. We have February 15th. So this Friday is the deadline to apply for one of our awards. We have 3 awards categories: Tribal Trailblazers, Cultural Changemakers, which is a new category for this year, as well as Emerging Leaders. We have a lot of stiff competition this year, just saying. Really amazing work that everyone's doing, but wanted to make sure everyone's aware that the deadline is this Friday. That will not be extended. Just also letting you know, you are now the included group. We have just posted our exhibits and marketing information on the website today. So if anyone is interested in supporting the event and the work that we are all collectively doing together and would like to do some marketing of your work and activities, you're welcome to peruse those and reach out if you have any questions. Also on the the conference NBCC website is hotel information that's already live. You can book your room anytime. We will be opening registration in March, along with when we're putting out our program, but you can see a day-by-day flow of events, what's happening when, because our event is changed this year, so it's a Friday, Saturday versus a Saturday, Sunday. So you can fly home on Saturday and or decide to stay in DC for Father's Day if you celebrate Father's Day. And I think the last thing I wanted to announce is we have closed our call for presentation proposals. We are still accepting for table topics for a limited time until we max that capacity, but we still have some opportunities there. So would love to hear from you, your organization, your coalition, about the work that you're up to, and if you'd like to share it, that's an opportunity that you'd want to get after soon. So lots of information on the conference website, and also please connect with us on Facebook as well. We'll post our updates there. Thanks so much for your patience. I want to hand it over to Danae, I think. Or back to Cheryl.
Thanks so much. And next we are going to pass to Danae Schmidt. She is going to share a little bit about USBC membership and close out this incredible webinar for us.
Hi everyone, my name is Danae Schmidt. I am the Member Relations and Operations Manager with USBC. I wanted to just do a quick update. Some of you may be subscribed to our weekly wire or some of our other listservs. I just wanted to make sure everyone knew that USBC is now accepting applications. We have expanded our membership categories to include breastfeeding coalitions as well as community-based organizations. You can read more about that on our website. Our membership relations coordinator, Adeline Robinson, will chat the information into the chat. We are also hosting a special webinar on February 27th to answer any questions, to talk about the categories, and provide information about the benefits to membership and the wider collaborative in USBC. The priority deadline for the applications is March 31st. If you would like to attend the USBC membership meeting this year as a member or representative, please make sure that you submit your application by March 31st. And of course, if you have any questions in the meantime, please go ahead and email membership@usbreastfeeding.org. Adeline, could you also please chat out the webinar registration so that folks can register for that if they are interested. Okay, and I think with that, we are going to close out our wonderful webinar. Thank you to our amazing panelists who shared such great work that they are doing. Please complete the evaluation. You can download a certificate of attendance for your records, and please share topics and speakers you want to see in upcoming webinars. We really hope this session has spurred you to connect with stakeholders in your communities and states and improve the landscape of breastfeeding support. Thank you all that you do. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in June at the conference. Thank you, everyone.